Tales from the Break Room is a viewer submission podcast, and we want to hear the scariest things that have happened to you at work. Send us your story at eeriecast.com/submit, and if we narrate your story, we'll pay you 5 cents per word. You've got to have a working PayPal and a well-written, believable, and actually creepy story. Thank you. Now hurry, go leave Tales from the Break Room a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts before the show really starts.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Ah, goodness. I really hope you're not eating lasagna right now. This is absolutely not a good time for Garfield to be listening. I'm on my break now, and boy do I have some crazy and creepy stories for you today. There will be forklift terror, bakery badness, and a paramedic's most dangerous encounter. After all this, you should absolutely wield your forklift license with respect. After all, with great power comes great responsibility. Enjoy. These are tales from the break room. The Vanishing Forklift, from Ruben Z. I've worked at a variety of jobs over the years, especially during the time after graduating college and in the current career I'm in right now. When I look back during those years, one job that sticks out the most is where I had one of my most scary experiences ever. I'm referring to the time I worked in a tomato paste processing plant located off Interstate 5 in Southern California. The job required me to work 12-hour shifts overnight, where another person and I moved a box of tomato paste under a machine that suctioned out the paste in the box. I didn't know what the purpose was, but it was dumb, dirty, and repetitive work. My partner and I would often switch from operating the forklift that brings the box to the machine to operating the machine itself. This was a good way for me to get forklift experience easily, without stressing out too much. One night, the partner I usually worked with stopped coming in due to high stress and demand of working the night shift. He was only 18 years old, but looked like he was in his 30s. Well, on that night, they threw in 2 new bodies to work the job I was doing. Since I was the more experienced of us, the supervisor of that warehouse made me the forklift operator for the whole night and the foreseeable future. Art, the foreman, ordered me not to switch with the newbies under any circumstances. Remember, you're our only forklift driver out there, so don't mess around too much. If you need more boxes or if I need something hauled, you get here as fast as possible. Comprende? I nodded in excitement. I was glad to do this. Now I didn't have to be on my feet anymore, and I wouldn't be covered in tomato paste. 9 hours into the shift is usually the easiest part of the job, but once 3 a.m. hits, the clock moves more slowly. Eventually, the supply of boxes in the warehouse wore down, and I would soon need to go get more from a storage house on the other side of the plant. Instead of waiting for the supervisor to tell me to go, I decided to show some initiative and go get it myself. I told the other guys that I'd be back with more boxes, and to just hang out and pretend to clean something to kill time. Being nighttime, the entire plant was quiet, and there was minimal foot traffic, so I took the opportunity to test my forklift drifting skills for fun and to break up the monotony of the job. Zipping and whipping in and around towers of crates, I quickly arrived at the front of the storage house. The building is on the edge of the plant, solitarily placed near acres of empty field. The path into the storage unit ended in a T intersection. I remember sensing a numbing cold sensation around my body. A glowing warm static tingled my fingers and nose. I was lost in my moment of dissociation. In that moment of blankness, a sharp light sawed through the haze and woke me up. A pair of headlights shone amongst obsidian darkness, and with it came a speeding forklift directly coming at me. Even though I was caught, instinct took over. My nerves immediately fired signals down to my right leg, crushing the brake. The momentum violently launched me forward. My left hand gripped the bar, holding the overhead guard. My body moved forward, but my left shoulder stayed behind. I heard cracking and popping from my shoulder, and I felt the bone shift, and quickly shift, as did the rest of my body when I stopped myself from flying out. An immense pain radiated from my shoulder, pulsing throughout my whole body. I grinded my teeth in frustration, blocking back tears. The forklift I would have crashed into swerved right into the warehouse. Looking up, I only saw the back of the forklift and the shadowy outline of a man driving into a dark warehouse, getting lost amongst the rows of boxes inside. Anger ballooned up inside, and I quickly drove into the warehouse after the other driver to see what his malfunction was. Frantically, I drove through each row looking for him. After turning each corner, I kept expecting to face the other forklift, but I never did. After checking each aisle over and over, my disbelief and worry increased. There's no way the other forklift left. There was only one entrance, and I knew he hadn't left. The realization crept up my spine, rocking everything I believed in. Had I just witnessed a ghost? I sat there in shock for what seemed like 20 minutes. I snapped out when the radio buzzed in, asking for an ETA on the crates. I woke up and began lifting boxes, driving back in stunned silence. The crew noticed my pale demeanor. "Yo, you okay?" I could only shake my head no in response. Concerned, they stopped what they were doing and approached me closer. "What's up, for real? What happened out there?" I looked at them, debating whether to tell them or not for a second, and I quickly spilled it. "I think I saw a ghost." Their disbelieving and intrigued faces studied me, looking for any hint that I was joking. But it was no joke. "Nah, man, don't say that's what happened. I mean, I believe in spirits and stuff, but don't freak me out." The other was more skeptical, but still wanted to hear the details. "On my way to the warehouse, I almost had another forklift crash into me. I followed it back to the warehouse. I looked everywhere, but they were gone. No forklift, no driver, just me." The two of them stood there in silence. Clearly uncomfortable, the one who believed in spirits grew paranoid, checking in and around his surroundings. The skeptical coworker tried rationalizing everything. The other guy was probably hiding somewhere in the warehouse. You just missed him, is all. I checked every possible space a forklift can be in there, and there was nothing. I'm telling you, I saw it go in and it disappeared. "No way, you're just tired. It's late out here and you have that high blood pressure or high sugar or something messing with you." I didn't respond to his accusations. I just sat there. Amidst the silence, the scared coworker softly spoke. "Remember what the supervisor said earlier? That you were the only forklift driver out tonight. So there couldn't have been anyone else driving a forklift." The realization finally started to sink into my skeptical coworker. It could have been the supervisor himself. At that moment, I grabbed my radio. "Hey, Art, were you on a forklift earlier?"
"No, I wasn't. Why you ask?"
The mood between us soured further, and even the skeptical one couldn't hold it anymore, growing more scared by the second. "I almost got hit by another forklift heading into the warehouse, but I can't find them anywhere." Silence hung in the air. The feeling was that the next response from Art wasn't a good one.
"Well, crap. Alright, at the next break I'll tell you boys about it. I was hoping it wouldn't come up, but I'll explain later."
We impatiently waited for the next break. We hardly worked anymore after that. We were mostly to ourselves, just looking around our surroundings. Finally, the last break of the shift came in. We then rushed into the break room and looked for Art. He pointed us toward a table with some coffee nearby ready for us. "Alright, so what you saw earlier with the forklift almost hitting you and disappearing, it's not the first time it happened. Most of the mechanics and older supervisors here have had experiences with it before. We think it's the ghost of an old employee. Back before my time, there was another night shift worker who would speed through the plant on a forklift. Well, one night he was going a little too fast and he didn't notice a newly stacked tower of tomato paste boxes where there usually isn't any. He tried to stop, but he ran into the boxes. Not only did he fly forward and splattered like a bug on a windshield, but the tower also stumbled over and crushed him. Boxes busted open, and he quickly became swamped in tomato paste. The cleanup was a mess. They couldn't tell what was paste or meat, I tell ya. The guy was practically a lasagna. From what I hear from the guys who witnessed it, to this day, they won't eat anything with tomato sauce because that's what it all smelled like. Except for the brains. They say the brains smelled like canned peaches, and they won't eat them anymore either. Everybody else in there was sucked into the story. Shocked, appalled, scared all at the same time. Art went on. Ever since then, people have seen this ghost riding around on a forklift late at night, and he'll just disappear. For the most part, he won't hurt you. He'll just scare you real bad. Art got up and left to do other duties, and the break was over. We all went back to work then. Those two never came back to work at the plant. I stayed on for another week and left after that. I found a job related to my degree. But ever since that night, I never sped in a forklift again during the remainder of my time there. I think it was a warning from that ghost, scaring others to prevent the same fate that befell him. Be honest with your paramedics. From Worried Healthworker. I worked as a paramedic in South Africa a few years ago. I worked in one of the country's most populated and substance-dependent areas. This particular call occurred when I was still new and arrogant. I thought I didn't need any backup. A call came through for a young man having a possible cardiac event. We loaded up and got going. Once we got there, we realized the place was an isolated, abandoned house. My partner and I walked up to the gate, which was already open. Immediately, I'm hit with this bad feeling in my gut. Not the normal, this is a sketchy area thing, but more of a, you need to run, now. I normally listen to my gut, but I knew I had a responsibility here. I pushed away the feeling, and we walked towards the house. My partner and I were chatting about the cardiac event and the possibilities of what we might be walking into. As soon as I got to the front door, we knew something was wrong. Normally, we'd have to have permission to enter a home, but in this case, the door was wide open, so we were allowed to go in. Inside, there was silence. No one screaming or calling for us. No one running towards us. We moved farther into the house. In what I can only assume was the lounge, we saw 3 people. 3 men, to be precise. One of them was on the ground. The others were sitting near him. There was no attempt to greet or acknowledge us. Someone call for an ambulance? My partner asked. Both the men who were sitting looked towards each other, then at us. Let's call them A and B. A was the closest towards me. He looked at B and then said something in a language I didn't understand. I could tell he was slurring his words too, and he was angry. Suddenly, A gets up and runs straight towards B, and they start to argue. I looked at my partner and he motioned towards the 2 of them, starting to move over there to take control of the situation. I knew this meant I was on patient duty. At that point, I could see our patient, C. He was curled up on the ground. As I made my way towards him, I started to take in the scene around us. There was vomit on the ground near him. He was thin and looked to have a rash on his arms. As I got near him, I could see his eyes were open, but they were glazed over. Luckily, he was conscious. "Hi, my name is N. I'm here to help you," I said, as I started to put my equipment down. As soon as my bag hit the floor, both A and B go silent. All I can hear is my partner trying to ask them questions. At this point, I looked around at my patient. Lying next to him is what looked to be a sugar straw. It was half smoked. I noticed it didn't smell like a cigarette or like marijuana. For context, a sugar straw is one of those colorful one-use straws. You normally buy a bunch of them really cheap. As soon as I saw this, I knew we were dealing with substance abuse. These straws are often used as they can be bought in bulk and do not require the coordination of rolling a cigarette. "I need to check your pulse. Is it okay if I take your hand?" I said to my patient. As soon as I touched him, he screamed out in pain. With that, the glazed eyes, the half-burnt straw, and vomit, I knew what I was dealing with. In South Africa, there's this substance, commonly referred to as nyope. It's a concoction of a bunch of really bad substances. I then hear A and B say something. They've realized that I know what's going on. I gesture to the straw and my partner comes over. I tell him what I think is happening and he confirms. Suddenly, and without warning, my partner is struck with something in the face. I then feel myself being slapped on the head. When I look up, I can see B standing right by me. He's shaky on his feet, as the drug can cause bad coordination. I stand up and B tries to run at me. He knocks me straight into the corner of the wall. All I can feel is immense pain shooting down my arm. I crumple to the floor in pain. I look up, and B is standing over me, screaming. I can see my partner, who's coming towards me now. I manage to stand up, and I'm struck in the face by B. At this point, I knew I needed to get out of there. It wasn't safe. We needed the police, and I think I needed medical attention. I couldn't move my arm, the same arm that crashed into the wall. Turns out B had enough strength to do some damage. I'm a barely 5'1" lean woman. I look very young too. My partner manages to shove B out of the way and help me up. The two of us get the heck out of there. My partner was already calling in for help. Now, the police in my country are not always reliable, and we don't work with them in the same way as they do in the US. Here, once we're safe, we normally have to wait for the police to make a statement. It can take over an hour just for them to show up. So we're taught to find a place that we could be safe at before calling the police. We made the decision then to drive away to a safer spot so we could assess ourselves and see the damage. I have no idea what I would have done without my partner. I've never experienced panic like this before. I came away with a damaged shoulder and a very bruised face. I'm lucky though. It could have gone much worse. My partner ended up with a bloody nose. I'm just thankful we made it out of there. Ambulance attacks do occur, but as with anything, you never think it'll happen to you. I have no idea what happened to my patient, but I do know I'm lucky I escaped with relatively minor injuries. Haunted Bakery from Cupcake. When I was 13, I experienced a sleep paralysis demon sighting. And since then, I've never had any phobia or anxiety that could compete with the sheer terror of that event. I was floating above my bed, looking down at my sleeping body. I looked up, and I heard several sickening cracks like bones popping and dislocating. I then saw that thing that haunts me to this day, 14 years later. In the corner of my room, perched on the ceiling, was this demonic thing. It looked like a shadowy monster with spider-like appendages, an ear-to-ear grin of shark-like rows of teeth, and it dripped black with ooze. Its eyes were merely black holes in its head, and as it twitched and writhed, all of its many legs cracked. I could simultaneously feel my immobile body, unable to move a single muscle. I could feel the pressure of the pillow on my cheek as I looked down at myself. I could also see it, looking down hungrily at my sleeping body. I realized it was about to make a mad dash to race my soul to it. Even though I woke up and realized it had all been a dream, I still made the assumption that I'd simply gotten to my body first. This is the reason why the events I'm about to describe did not send me noping away from the haunted bakery at light speed. To me, I'd encountered sheer terror before. So in 2018, I worked at a bakery for a man I'll be referring to as Tom. Tom was a nice enough guy. He paid me too well to do such an easy job, but as his products had become more popular, he was spending all his free time at work instead of at home with his wife. The treat we were making was just a small cake dipped in chocolate, but it sold like there was no tomorrow. The bakery, as he called it, was in the back room of a warehouse which sold antiques and art. This was not a storefront. He just delivered the bags of treats to local businesses for retail sale. In my first week working there, I began to notice really strange things about the place. If not for my previously mentioned demon encounter, I likely would have gotten the feeling of being watched or having creepy vibes, as some of the other customers in the antique section had mentioned. One day I was sitting in front of my melted chocolate bowl, and I turned around to get another tray of cakes from the counter behind me. When I reached to grab the dipping fork from where I'd left it on the table, I groped around at an empty space instead. Okay, I thought, I must have dropped it or something. I got up from my stool to look at the ground, thinking I had accidentally just knocked it off without noticing. I mean, I had just been using it for the previous tray, so it couldn't have gone far. Or so I thought. "Hey, what you looking for?" Tom asked, looking up from the mixer. "I think I dropped my fork, or maybe I set it somewhere different, I'm not sure," I explained. He came over to help me search. After about 2 minutes of us looking all over for it, I had just about given up, grabbing a new one to start dipping again. But then, Tom came in from the packaging room, holding a fork with still melted chocolate on the tines. We stared at each other in silence for a moment, knowing that neither of us had gotten up to go into the other room for hours, let alone recently enough for that chocolate to not have cooled enough to dry, which would take about 5 minutes. Why he even checked in there for it was a mystery to me, but I think at that point, he was just wandering around aimlessly. It was just on the counter, by the printer. Kinda creepy, right? He asked, tossing it into the sink. I nodded but continued dipping the cakes, not really sure how to react to something happening right under my nose like that. The next incident happened more literally under our noses. I suddenly started smelling really strong cracked peppercorns, like the fresh ones you get from a grinder. "So, new ingredient in the cakes, huh?" I joked, looking at him. He gazed back at me quizzically before smelling it for himself. He covered his nose in revulsion. "What the heck is that smell?" "Smells like black pepper to me," I said, sniffing and feeling an oncoming sneeze. Our room had nothing but cake batter and chocolate for food. There should have been nothing like that smell in here. We headed out through the door that led to the main warehouse area. Immediately, outside our door is an area that only had paintings, so it wasn't like some customer had been fiddling with an antique grinder with the remnants of old peppercorn still left over in it. I walked down the hallway a bit to check if maybe someone had been near us, someone who could have left such a strange scent. But it was empty, as the shop usually was. I then went back to dipping my chocolate, and Tom opened the back entrance to air out the pepper scent. Over the next weeks, we experienced several similar incidents, such as things disappearing and reappearing in places they should not be, sudden freezing cold temperatures with no vents nearby, random disembodied voices when no one else was around, the microwave door randomly swinging open. All of this I shrugged off. We actually just joked about it to the front desk worker usually, always referring to it as the haunted bakery in jest. I finally had made enough money working for him that I was able to get a new car, as my old junker had failed me on Christmas Eve, when all the mechanics in my small town were closed on my way to a family function. The money and the ease of the job were surefire reasons for me to stay, despite the oddness. The incident that actually bothered me happened one day when I was carrying a bowl of melted chocolate over to my side of the table. Suddenly, it felt like a strong hand slapped the bowl straight down, causing it to smash into the ground. Startled, Tom whipped his head around, taking in the sights of chocolate and chunks of glass now coating the walls and my legs. After a string of expletives about the cost of wasted product and equipment, it dawned on him that the look on my face and the sheer height the chocolate had been splattered up the wall gave him pause. It felt like someone slapped the bowl. I didn't drop it, I mumbled, stunned into silence by the shock. He nodded, realizing that the distance it would have fallen from my arm's height should not have been high enough to cause the Pyrex to shatter on the rubber floor mat like it had. Yeah, that really would have required way more force for that type of bowl to break like that," he said. I slowly nodded. I'd been trying to mentally chalk it up as only being a weird double-arm simultaneous muscle twitch or something, but I was forced to behold the reality of how hard it had hit the ground as he said that out loud to me. As I cleaned up the mess, I pondered how this was the first physical interaction I'd felt from one of these supposed entities residing here. For the rest of the evening, I considered the history of the building as I bagged up the treats and labeled them, preparing them for their deliveries. It used to be an office building/warehouse for Coca-Cola back in 1913, and now it rents space to a soapsmith, baker, painters, and the large open portion contains antiques. Any negative energy residue on the antiques, residual hatred of the cola workers, or passing demonic spirits could have been the result of this interaction. It was the first time in a while that I'd been genuinely shocked, but I was still able to brush it off as some muscle twitch in my arms. About a week after that incident, I began noticing a lot of changes in Tom. He'd always been a really laid-back guy, but he started getting increasingly more aggressive. He experienced very strong mood swings that nearly gave me whiplash. One day I would come to work and he would comment on how I was such a strong member of the team. He was rewarding me with a $1 hourly raise randomly. And 2 days after that, he said I was useless, stupid, and a number of other words I'll leave to the profane imagination. A few days after that, he had brought me a case of root beer and Cool Ranch Doritos, which I'd mentioned in past conversations to have been my favorites of the snack world, and he said it was for his favorite and only employee. Another thing that worried me was the way he talked about one of his clients. This particular client was my previous employer at the place I'd met Tom. Although she was genuinely terrible, he would regularly talk about wanting to hurt her whenever they had to interact. He would call her even more horrible things than he called me that one time, and he would do it often. It had gotten to be so bad, I convinced him to terminate his contract with her, so he didn't have to go on a whole rampage every time she failed to pay her percentage. His mood swings eventually got so bad, I suggested that we work in the kitchen at separate times. I began to wonder if he was having bouts of spiritual possession, or something along those lines, with how dark he could get. However, extremes on both ends of the happy or angry spectrum tend to disrupt a workflow, so he agreed that we would adjust our schedules. I started doing the baking, dipping, and packaging, and he would come later to package, clean the dishes and floors, and deliver the treats. This worked out for me, as I was a bit of a night owl anyway, and if I worked 12 a.m. to 8 a.m., the treats would be fresh when the customers got them as the store opened. At first, all was going well with our new schedule, thanks to not having to deal with his mania, then negativity, cycles, and I thought I could just peacefully listen to music and dip my cakes since I was alone. As it turned out, these spooks were about to get exponentially worse with the darkness. Walking down the hall to the bathroom one night, I heard whispering. Thinking how strange it was since it was like 2 a.m., and there would be no customers or employees in the whole facility, I thought, who could be talking? As I neared the bathroom, more and more voices started to raise the volume, speaking louder and louder until it sounded like 20 different people were all standing right in the hall with me, shouting in a horrible cacophony that made me cover my ears with my hands and run to the restroom. The walk back was a normal one, and disappointment filled me when I checked the parking lot for any other cars and found none but my own. The following days were filled with similar events, such as the faucet suddenly turning on full blast, the microwave door swinging open and closed, the lights flickering on and off, and objects being misplaced the moment my gaze was averted. I felt more annoyed than anything at this mischievous behavior and its inconveniences, but eventually I grew accustomed to my troublesome nuisance of a new coworker that seemed to do everything in its power to make my job as bothersome as possible. I considered that someone should give this new employee a raise, assuming its job was to be as aggravating as it could. Again, it never managed to make me feel in mortal danger, except for the bowl incident. As such, I remained working there until the summer. Tom's sales became too low for him to employ me full-time any longer. The potential possession situation to me seemed like negative and positive vibes floating through the ether, latching themselves onto an individual, and him being extremely receptive to them. If I had to give a definite answer to the cause of all the mischief, I felt most strongly that there was residual energy left over from the antique's previous owners, and maybe even some energy left from the previous workers when it was a Coca-Cola office. It felt like some sort of childish ghost simply wanted attention and enjoyed throwing tantrums, rather than some sort of nightmare monster trying to kill me. Graveyard shift. From Mike. I'm a 35-year-old guy from the outskirts of New York City, now living in a quiet little town in Massachusetts. I'm what you might call an average Joe, always keeping to myself, never really been much for social gatherings. But don't get me wrong, I'm no recluse. I just prefer the solace of the quiet, and that is exactly why I chose my current profession, a night guard at our local cemetery. Working at a cemetery isn't as creepy as some people might think. You get used to the quiet, the somber vibe, that ever-present air of melancholy. But there's a certain calmness in it. On that fateful winter night in December, when the whole town was covered in snow, I had no idea that my view of this job and my life was about to change forever. My shift started like any other day. I walked around the graves with a flashlight in hand, inspecting each headstone, making sure nothing was disturbed. As the snow fell lightly, casting a serene white blanket over the cemetery, it was a sight to behold. But as I made my way towards the back of the cemetery, a strange feeling came over me. I noticed tracks in the snow leading towards the oldest part of the cemetery, a section rarely visited. Thinking at worst it was just some teenagers up to no good, I decided to investigate. As I followed those tracks, I saw that they led to the mausoleum of a wealthy family who had passed away over a century ago. The heavy iron door was ajar. Odd, I thought. That thing has always been locked. Just as I was about to close the door, I started to hear whispers coming from inside the mausoleum. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open wider. Illuminated by the glow of my flashlight, the stone floor had symbols etched into it. There were also lit candles arranged in a circle, and there was a low murmuring chant which sent shivers down my spine. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the wintry night. I'd stumbled onto some sort of gathering, a cult meeting perhaps. Fear and curiosity battled inside me, but in the end, I decided it was best to get out of here and call the police. I was just about to take a step backward when a hand suddenly clamped firmly down on my shoulder. I froze, my heart about to burst. I screamed then and turned to the side, just running. Behind me, I heard a woman's voice yelling, "Run!" and laughter accompanying it. While I ran, like in a bad movie, I ended up slipping on the icy ground and I fell into the thick snow. As I scrambled back up and sprinted away, I looked back one last time, only to see hooded figures emerging from the darkness of the mausoleum. The snow seemed to absorb their figures as they stood silently, watching me. I felt a sudden dread, a primal fear, and I knew I had to get away as fast as possible to get help. I made it back to the security cabin, panting and gasping, and immediately I reached for the phone to call the police. As I described what I'd seen, I could not shake off the feeling of being watched. I glanced out the window. My blood ran cold when I saw them. Hooded figures standing on the edge of the cemetery, ominously silent. As I waited for the police to arrive, I was trapped in my own nightmare. The cemetery was no longer a place of peace, but a hunting ground of the unknown. I felt as if I was living a horror story, which might be far from over. To be honest, I was scared for my life. Minutes felt like hours as I huddled in that security cabin, my eyes glued to the dark figures lingering at the cemetery's edge. I wanted to run, but where would I go? I was already in the middle of nowhere, and the only sign of civilization was the cemetery itself. Suddenly, the figures began to move, coming closer to the cabin. Panic set in as they moved closer, with a slow and deliberate pace. I grabbed my flashlight, my only semblance of a weapon, and I braced myself. The crunching snow under their feet was all I could hear, a sinister rhythm marking their approach. Just when they were almost at the cabin, red and blue lights flooded the cemetery. The wailing siren sliced through the night as a police car skidded to a halt by the cemetery gates. The hooded figures abruptly stopped, turned, and ran into the darkness. The police officers found me shaken but unharmed. I guided them to the mausoleum, the dread weighing heavy on me as we approached. I half expected the hooded figures to emerge again, but there was only silence. The door was still ajar, but as we stepped inside, we found the mausoleum empty. The symbols which had been etched on the floor and the remnants of the extinguished candles were the only evidence of the cult's presence. The rest of the night was a blur of statements and reassurance. The police promised to conduct regular patrols and suggested I take a few days off. Yet when I left the cemetery that morning, the rising sun failed to ward off the chill that had lodged itself into my heart. In the following days, the terror of that night began to fade, but it never truly left me. I returned to my post after a week, the cemetery now under the vigilant watch of the local authorities. Yet the silence of the graveyard was no longer comforting. Every shadow, every whisper of the wind seemed to echo with the chilling memory of that night. Every night I find myself glancing towards the mausoleum, half expecting to see the hooded figures to emerge again. They never did. The incident at this cemetery was the most terrifying experience of my life, something I'll carry with me till the end. My nights at the cemetery are no longer peaceful. They're a constant reminder of the unknown lurking in the dark, the thin line that separates the world we know and the world we fear. From a security personnel to an unwilling participant in a nightmare, my life took a turn I never saw coming. As I share my story, I want you to remember, sometimes the things that go bump in the night are far more real than we'd like to believe. Even in the most tranquil places, there is darkness. Rookie, from KeyTurner. I'd just been hired on as a correctional officer at a correctional facility hidden back into the woods off a long service road. I'd yet to finish my probation or hit my hours to be considered a correctional officer, so I was still considered a security officer. Practically a nobody in the eyes of the seasoned officers who had seen and dealt with things at the time I wouldn't have even imagined could happen. This being 13 years ago, I'm now a supervisor. I know better. I'd received training in the records department, dealing with intakes and release, working on files and legal documentation. One day, as the evening went on, the last officer left for the evening, leaving me alone to finish up the night's work before locking up for the night and heading home around 2300 hours. The normal routine would be whoever was the night shift supervisor coming in periodically to check on you, as my department was somewhat secluded from the rest of the prison. It was a small outbuilding at the back of the property that, aside from me, was unoccupied for the night. But like I mentioned earlier, I was only a security officer. I'd be lucky to see anyone all night, as in their eyes I haven't put in the time to be considered worth checking on. Another thing about my department was that right outside my door was the old segregation. Now, I fully believe that dark, depressing places, which have had horrific things happen there, attract spirits or entities. What better location for something to happen than an old prison? As the night wore on, I was nearly finished with my work when I heard the large steel door at the end of the hallway open up. Now, the department only has 3 doors to get in. One coming from the outside, which was positioned right next to my office. One connecting my department to another, which was a regular lift-weight wooden door. And one at the end of the hall that is a big steel door with a heavy clunky handle and deadbolt, which can be very easily heard and identified due to the weight and awkwardness to open it. As soon as I heard the steel door being opened and shut, I called out, "About time someone came to visit." But there was only silence in response. I peeked around the corner within seconds of making the comment, worried I'd offended the officer. But it was empty. No one was there. I quickly headed to the door to check. All the locks were still secure. I did a quick check of the building and nobody was there but me. From the location of the building, you can see anyone walking up or away from the building, and whoever did this would have had no time, even if they ran, to make it back down without being seen. I packed up my work and closed up for the night. I would continue working at that facility for years before wanting a change and transferring elsewhere. Guess I'll never know what truly haunted that place. Hazmat Man, from Brandon C. I was doing a delivery for work in Grove City, Pennsylvania. The unloading area was right off of the one road in this particular part of town. As the guy started unloading my truck with his forklift, a couple of other guys came out, seemingly just to chat. The guy on the forklift pointed to the road and asks if I see what he's seeing. After I told him no and looked at the road, I saw it. There was a tall, broad man wearing a fluorescent yellow jumpsuit, which resembled a hazmat suit. It was the same shade of yellow as the stereotypical selection of raincoats or rain boots. Keep in mind, it was a very hot and sunny day out. He was wearing bulky black boots and gloves that looked like the ones you'd wear in snowy weather, and one of those N95 type face masks. All of his skin was covered, save for his eyes. I'm 5'10" and 240 pounds with a broad build, and this guy looked like he would tower over me. This alone was strange, but his behavior was also very off. He walked in a very exaggerated manner. It almost looked like he was dance walking. He stopped when a kid about 10 years old happened to ride by on his bicycle. He stopped the kid and began to talk to him. One of the guys helping unload my truck loudly told us to check if he knows that kid. After that, the man and the boy went in opposite directions. The man then stopped, looked at me, and waved. It was hard to tell, but it looked like his eyes were squinted as if he was smiling a really big smile under that mask. I didn't wave back. I just kept watching him. I even got this sense of dread looking at the guy. Everything about him seemed off. He walked by the guard shack in front of the unloading zone, which blocked my view of him. Then he was gone, without a trace. The road was open with no surrounding woods or intersecting roads nearby. It would have been extremely obvious if he came out from around the shack, but he never did. I even went over and walked around, trying to find him, and I didn't. I even looked again as I was driving away, but the man was gone like he was never there. What could this have been? Some creep or criminal? Was this something paranormal, like the grinning man, but in a hazmat suit? An interdimensional being? I don't know. What I do know is that it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me, because 5 other people all saw the same thing. Screaming Trees, from Z2Gao 8. Back in 1996, I experienced something so bizarre that I will never ever forget it for the rest of my life. I worked for a big logging company near Munich in the Bavarian forest as a logger. It was just 1 week before Christmas, and this was our last week before the holidays started. The weather was already very bad. Freezing wind, tons of wet snow. We were working in a very isolated spot in the woods. We could only get there by foot. We would have to leave our vehicle, a Unimog, by the side of a small hiking trail to do so. On that day, I was working alone. I only needed to cut 4 trees and mark the other trees with a spray can. We only cut down smaller trees in this area to give the bigger trees more room to grow. As soon as I arrived at the spot, it already felt a bit off. If you spend so much time in a forest, like from day to day, you know all the sounds and smells. But on that day, I heard nothing. Only the squeaking noise the pines made in the wind. But no animal noises at all. Of course, in wintertime, you don't hear as many animal noises compared to summertime. But I'm telling you, it was dead silent. As I already mentioned, it was almost Christmas, and I was really looking forward to spending the holidays with my family. I was determined to get this job done and go home as soon as possible. I decided to first mark the trees needed to be cut down. This took me quite some time because the terrain was very steep and slippery due to heavy rain and snowfall. All this time, I had a strange feeling of someone watching me. I couldn't explain, but I just felt uncomfortable and even had to sit down for a moment because I couldn't breathe. I also found some very strange carvings in some trees. They seemed to have been made very recently. They were 3 horizontal stripes with 1 vertical stripe on top. It was absolutely man-made. Before long, I started to cut some trees down. I grabbed my chainsaw and walked up to the first tree. I started the chainsaw, but as soon as I began to cut the tree, I got the biggest scare of my life. I kid you not when I say this, but the tree started to scream. I swear to God the tree was screaming like I was cutting someone's leg or arm off, a human scream. Horrified, I stopped my chainsaw. What I saw next startled me so bad I couldn't move. A red liquid was pouring out of the tree. It looked a lot like blood. In a short moment, I looked up and I saw that the tree had the strange marking on it too. I didn't hesitate. I ran back to my vehicle as quickly as I could, leaving some of my equipment behind. The whole time, I could hear the screaming coming out of that tree. I jumped in my Unimog and drove as fast as I could out of that forest. Back at the sawmill, I didn't tell anyone what I experienced. I was sure nobody would believe me. They would probably just make fun of me for weeks on end. But I also knew that the work wasn't done yet, and I would have to go back there after the holidays. But that would be my last day working for the company, because 2 days after New Year's, I quit and got a new job. I never had to go back to that place again. School Janitor, from Boink W98. I'm a janitor at a high school in my hometown of Brandywine, Maryland. It's summer break right now, so I'm the only one who's consistently still going to school. I go Monday through Friday and just do basic cleaning to keep the hallways and general areas clean. A lot of people don't know that janitorial service members do this, even when school's on break. I start at 10:30 and usually finish around 6:30 in the afternoon. It's a big school, so I recently hired a young man to help me out with all the cleaning. He's been working with me for about a month now, and everything has been going smoothly. He was a quiet and hard-working guy. I'd never had anyone help me out before, so I was hoping he would continue to work out fine and stay with me throughout the whole summer. It was just unfortunate that didn't happen. He worked with me the first week, and suddenly he just stopped coming back. It was Wednesday of the next week, and he had not shown up nor contacted me at all. If he didn't want to work here, that's fine, but I just needed to get the spare key to the school back from him. It had been about a month since his last day. His name was Johnny, by the way. One day I came to work at the usual 10:30. I noticed the front door's chain was on the ground, and the door was unlocked. I'd swore that I locked it. I'd been doing this for so long, I've never left the school unlocked at the end of the day. Since I was so sure this wasn't me who left it like this, I thought about who else could have done it, and the only person who had the key was Johnny. I opened up the front door. All the lights were still off. Upon turning those lights on, I saw pieces of paper thrown about all over the lobby. These papers were organized on the floor, though, not just scattered randomly. Most of the papers were blank, but there were some that contained handwritten notes on them. The first one I found closest to the front door entrance read, "Hey, it's me." I continued to pick up the rest of the papers and found another note that was placed right at the entrance to the school's main hallway. The paper read, "Big school, isn't it? Would be a shame if someone were lost in here. Find 'em." That one made me feel uneasy. I didn't know what to think. Who was writing these? Who was I looking for? I mean, it had to be Johnny, right? But why would he write the notes, then go hide like he was playing a game? He didn't show up for a month, then suddenly came back and did this. But why? After cleaning up all the papers in the lobby, I looked around for anything else unusual. In the middle of the hallway, there was an open classroom door. I walked over and began to close it, but I heard then what sounded like a chair sliding out from under a desk. Immediately, I entered the room, assuming I would soon see Johnny. But there was nothing. All the chairs, except one, had been put away. This one chair was in the front of the classroom facing the door. That sent chills down my spine, especially after seeing I was alone in the room. I put the chair away and closed the door behind me. When I got back out into the hallway, I found another piece of paper taped to a locker. The paper didn't have a note this time. Instead, it had a drawing. The drawing was of a shadow figure sitting in a chair in the classroom, at the front of the room, just like the chair in the classroom I was just in. More shivers. I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, up and down. It felt as if I was being watched. Just as I stopped my frantic movements, I heard what sounded like footsteps running down the adjacent hallway, up the steps to the second floor. The footsteps stopped suddenly and became a loud walk that echoed throughout the whole school. Once the footsteps stopped, it was deadly silent. Then there was a loud bang that sounded like someone slamming a locker door open and closing it repeatedly. The slamming kept going, echoing throughout the hallways of the school. I decided I had to figure out who was in the school with me, so I quickly gathered myself and made my way up the stairs. Once I got to the second floor, the slamming stopped, but I saw that one of the lockers was open. When I reached the locker, I found a book inside. The book was an old yearbook that was open but faced down on the locker floor. I picked it up, carefully fingering the page it was on. I turned the book over and looked at the page. It was the section with all the students' pictures, but there was a young man in the bottom right of the page with his pictures circled. The young man was Johnny. That couldn't be right. How could he be in that yearbook? The yearbook was dated 1964. That couldn't be possible. I thought I was seeing things, losing my mind even. I couldn't take my eyes off that page. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Under Johnny's picture in that yearbook, to this day what I saw gives me chills. It read, "I will always be in this school. You'll find me." As soon as I finished reading this quote, I got a shiver down my spine again. I quickly snapped my head to the right, towards the windows at the end of the hall. In front of the window, I swear I saw Johnny. He was staring at me, but he was clearly not okay. His eyes seemed lifeless, his skin pale as the white walls. He moved his lips, but I couldn't understand what he was mumbling. He locked eyes with me before turning and walking down the steps. I was frozen still. I couldn't move no matter how hard I tried. I dropped the yearbook out of fear. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally was able to move and I made my way towards those steps. But Johnny was no longer there. I searched the remainder of the school, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. When I was locking up for the day, there in front of the door keyhole was the spare key I'd given Johnny. There was a piece of paper on the floor that read, "It was nice to meet you. See you around." I locked up and quickly went home, feeling uncomfortable the whole way. I didn't know how to comprehend what was going on. Why was Johnny there and what happened to him? I tried to find some information on him and on the school online, but I came up empty-handed. I don't know how I was able to sleep that night. But the next day when I went to work, I saw Johnny inside the school, standing in the glass of the front door staring blankly at me. I didn't go inside that day. I requested a transfer to a different school, and I haven't been inside that high school since.
Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.